The sound of a British engine at full throttle is something you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The deep bark of a Triumph Twin, the howl of an Aston Martin V8, the thunder of a Rolls-Royce Merlin pushing a Spitfire through the sky. Some engines do not just produce power, they produce emotion. And the 5 engines on this list are the loudest, the proudest, and the most unforgettable that British engineering has ever created. The number 1 engine on this list was so loud that racetrack organizers banned it. 5 engines, 5 completely different sounds, and only one was the loudest. Let us count them down. Number 5. The Rolls-Royce Merlin V12, Derby, 1933. The Merlin is not a car engine, it is an aircraft engine, but it belongs on this list because it is the most famous British engine ever built, and because its sound defined a generation. The Merlin was a 27-liter V12, producing over 1,000 horsepower in its later versions, powering the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane during the Second World War. The sound of a Merlin at full throttle is a sound that anyone who lived through the war never forgot. A deep, mechanical howl that started as a rumble and built into a scream as the supercharger forced air into the 12 cylinders at enormous pressure. The Merlin also found its way into an unexpected place. After the war, surplus Merlins were sold for scrap prices, and enterprising mechanics installed them in powerboats. The Merlin powered hydroplanes that raced on the lakes and rivers of Britain at 200 miles per hour, and the sound of a Merlin engine screaming across water at full throttle was one of the most terrifying and exhilarating sounds in British motorsport. The Detroit River races and the Coniston water record attempts used Merlin engines, and Donald Campbell set world water speed records in Bluebird, powered by a derivative of the Merlin. The Merlin was not just the engine that won the war, it was the engine that refused to die, that found new life in boats, in cars, and in the memories of everyone who ever heard it run. Over 200,000 Merlins were built, and after the war, enterprising engineers put them in cars, in boats, and in tractors. The most famous Merlin-powered car is the Rolls-Royce-powered dragster known as the Beast, which used a Merlin engine to attempt 200 miles per hour on British roads. The Merlin at idle sounds like the earth trembling. At full throttle, it sounds like the sky is splitting open. There is no engine on earth that sounds quite like a Merlin, and anyone who has heard one in person carries that memory forever. Number 4. The Aston Martin V8. Newport Pagnell, 1969. Tadek Marek, a Polish-born engineer working for Aston Martin, designed the V8 that would power the DBS, the V8 Vantage, and later the Virage. The engine was a 5.3-liter all-alloy V8, producing between 315 and 400 horsepower depending on the version. The sound was the thing. Aston Martin tuned the exhaust to produce a deep, resonant bass note at idle that rose to a full-throated roar under acceleration. The V8 Vantage, launched in 1977, was one of the first cars to be praised specifically for its exhaust note, and journalists at the time wrote that the engine sounded like a symphony orchestra tuning up before a performance. The Aston Martin V8 was not the most powerful engine of its era, but it was the most musical. Each exhaust pulse was tuned to harmonize, creating a sound that was not just loud but beautiful. Production of the original V8 lasted until 1990, with roughly 5,000 units built. The Aston Martin V8 also became the voice of a brand. Every Aston Martin since the original V8 has been tuned to produce a version of that same sound, from the Virage of the 1980s to the modern Vantage. The engineers at Aston Martin know that the sound is part of the identity, and they spend hundreds of hours in the recording studio, tuning the exhaust, the intake, and the engine mounts to ensure that every Aston Martin sounds like an Aston Martin. The sound of the V8 is the sound of British luxury, of grand touring, of the open road and the green countryside. It is a sound that was designed, not accidental, and that intention is what makes it immortal. The Aston Martin V8 was not the loudest engine on this list, but it was the most deliberately beautiful. Today, the V8 Aston Martins of the 70s and 80s are prized for their sound, and owners start them in garages just to hear the engine breathe. Number 3. The Triumph Speed Twin Parallel Twin Engine, Meriden, 1937. Edward Turner designed the Speed Twin engine in 1936, and it changed motorcycling forever. The 500 cubic centimeter parallel twin produced 27 horsepower, which was enormous for a motorcycle in the late 30s, and the sound was instantly recognizable. The parallel twin configuration, with both pistons rising and falling together, produced a distinctive thump that sounded like a heartbeat amplified through a brass pipe. The Speed Twin engine was so successful that nearly every British motorcycle manufacturer copied the layout, and the Triumph Parallel Twin also powered an entire industry. The engine was licensed, copied, and adapted by manufacturers around the world, and the Parallel Twin layout became the standard for medium displacement motorcycles for decades. The sound of the Triumph Twin was the sound of Britain in the 50s and 60s, as common on the high street as the sound of a bus or a police siren. Every village had a rider with a Triumph, and every rider knew the sound of the engine, as well as the sound of their own voice. The Triumph Twin was not just an engine. It was a cultural artifact, a piece of Britain that traveled the world and that still resonates today. The Parallel Twin became the signature sound of British motorcycling for the next 40 years. Triumph, BSA, Norton, Ariel, Royal Enfield, they all built Parallel Twins, and they all sounded slightly different, but the basic character was the same. That vertical twin beat, even and mechanical, with a snarl on acceleration and a purr at idle. The Bonneville, the most famous Triumph of all, used a direct descendant of the Speed Twin engine, and when a Bonneville fires up, anyone within earshot knows exactly what kind of motorcycle is coming. A question for you: Triumph Twin or Norton Twin? Write just the name in the comments. Both sound incredible. Only one can be your favorite. Number 2. The Norton Dominator Twin. Bracebridge Street, 1948. The Norton Dominator, also known as the Domo, used a 500 cubic centimeter parallel twin, but with a crucial difference from the Triumph. The Norton engine used a single camshaft instead of twin camshafts, and the cylinder head was designed differently. The result was a sound that was sharper, crisper, and more aggressive than the Triumph. The Norton Twin also had a technical advantage that few riders knew about. The Norton engine used a twin camshaft design that allowed more precise valve timing than the Triumph single cam, and the cylinder head was designed by Bert Hopwood, one of the greatest British engine designers. Hopwood had worked at Triumph, at Norton, and at Ariel, and his engines were known for their crisp throttle response and their willingness to rev. The Norton Twin at high revolutions had a sharpness and urgency that the Triumph lacked. The Triumph was smooth, the Norton was sharp, and the difference was there in the sound for anyone with the ear to hear it. Norton enthusiasts described the Dominator sound as a mechanical bark, as opposed to the Triumph's thump. The Dominator was also the engine that powered the Norton Commando, the last great British motorcycle of the classic era. The Commando's 750 cubic centimeter version of the engine produced 65 horsepower and had a sound that was been described as the best exhaust note of any production motorcycle ever built. The Commando engine at full throttle, with open megaphone exhausts, was one of the loudest, rawest, most thrilling sounds in motorcycling. Riders who raced Commandos in production races in the 70s recall the sound bouncing off the grandstands, a wall of noise that made the crowd grip the barriers. The Norton Twin may not have been as smooth as a Japanese 4, but for sheer character, for pure sonic impact, nothing matched it. Number 1. The BRM V16, born 1949, British Racing Motors, known as BRM, set out to build the most extreme Formula One engine ever attempted. The result was a 1.5-liter supercharged V16, producing an astonishing 600 horsepower. 600 horsepower from 1.5 liters. The engine was so complex that it had its own team of mechanics just to start it, and the starting procedure involved 2 separate mechanics turning different controls in a specific sequence, while a third held the starter. The sound was beyond anything else in motorsport. The V16 configuration, with 16 cylinders in a narrow V, spinning to over 12,000 revolutions per minute, produced a shriek that could be heard from miles away. Spectators at the 1950s British Grand Prix described the sound as a banshee wail that physically hurt the ears at close range. The engine was so loud that some track marshals refused to work near the BRM pit lane. The V16 was also unreliable, temperamental, and almost impossible to drive, with a power delivery that went from nothing to everything in a split second. But the sound was unmatched. The BRM V16 was also a monument to an era when Britain built things that nobody else dared to build. The 1950s were the decade of the British racing industry, when small workshops in Bourne, in Coventry, and in Surrey produced engines and cars that challenged the world. BRM, Connaught, Vanwall, Cooper, Loudest, they were all small, underfunded, and brilliant. The V16 was the extreme example, an engine so complex, so powerful, and so loud that it seemed to come from another planet. And in a way, it did. It came from the planet of British engineering, where impossible was not a word, but a challenge. No engine before or since has produced the same combination of volume, pitch, and sheer mechanical fury. The BRM V16 ran for only a few seasons, winning just a single Formula One race. But the legend of its sound lives on. Anyone who heard it in person, and that number is dwindling, describes it as the most extraordinary sound they have ever heard from an engine. The sound of 16 cylinders at 12,000 revolutions per minute, amplified by a massive supercharger, is a sound that does not exist anywhere else in the world. The sound of an engine is more than noise. It is information. A trained ear can tell the health of an engine from the sound alone, the condition of the bearings, the timing of the valves, the mixture of the carburetors. In the days before electronic diagnostics, the sound was the diagnostic tool, and every mechanic in Britain could listen to an engine and know what was wrong. The British motorcycle industry, in particular, relied on sound. The BSA Twin sounded different from the Triumph Twin, which sounded different from the Norton Twin, and the riders knew their engines by ear. The sound was the signature, the fingerprint, and the soul of the machine. When the Japanese motorcycles arrived, with their smooth, quiet four-cylinder engines, the British riders missed the sound. The Japanese bikes were faster, more reliable, and cheaper, but they sounded like sewing machines. The British bikes sounded like life. 5 engines, 5 completely different sounds. We started with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the V12 that won the war and shook the earth. Then the Aston Martin V8, the most musical engine ever built. Next, the Triumph Speed Twin, the heartbeat of British motorcycling. Then the Norton Dominator, the sharpest bark on 2 wheels. And finally, the BRM V16, the engine so loud it was banned. The most surprising thing about this list is that the loudest engine did not come from the biggest manufacturer. It came from a tiny workshop in Bourne, Lincolnshire, where a team of engineers built an engine that the world had never heard before and has never heard since. And one final thought, the sound of a British engine is disappearing. The Merlin engines are grounded, kept in museums. The Aston Martin V8 is being replaced by turbocharged hybrids. The Triumph and Norton twins are echoes of a past that will not return. And the BRM V16 exists in only a handful of running examples, maintained by dedicated enthusiasts who know that when the last engine stops running, the sound dies forever. So if you ever have the chance to hear any of these engines in person, take it, stand close, close your eyes, listen. Because that sound is the sound of a country that once built the best engines in the world, and the memory of that sound is worth more than any recording. These engines were more than machines. They were voices. They were the sound of British engineering at full volume, unfiltered, unapologetic, and unforgettable. Which of these 5 engines would you want to hear one more time? Merlin, Aston, Triumph, Norton, or BRM? Write just the name in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey through British engineering, leave a like and subscribe. And tell us what you want us to take apart next. British tractors, British trucks, British trains, or something else entirely.